Good morning. For those of you who don't know me, my name is William Albon, and today I've been asked to represent the publisher, Elakir Books, at today's proceedings, the launch of Dr. Theophanous' book, Understanding Multiculturalism and an Australian Identity. I'd very warmly like to welcome the Prime Minister of Australia, the Right Honourable Paul Keating, his and Dr. Theophanous' parliamentary colleagues, distinguished members of the diplomatic corps, ladies and gentlemen, comrades, welcome to the launch of Elakir's book, Understanding Multiculturalism and Australian Identity. Significantly, we're pleased to have with us today persons and many people involved in the development of multiculturalism in Australia. And in particular, we acknowledge amongst us Al Grasby, Lois O'Donoghue and Victor Rebikoff. The Minister for Immigration, Senator Nick Bolkus, has provided the foreword for this book, and Elakir Books acknowledge and thank him for that contribution. Senator Bolkus says in his foreword, and I quote, that our author, Dr. Theophanous, is well placed to enhance Australians' understanding of the concept of multiculturalism. Senator Bolkus says Dr. Theophanous has a long and distinguished commitment to social justice for people of a non-English speaking background. I'm sure you all concur. Elakir Books are proud to be associated with this publication that, as the text on the back cover of the book, quoting Dr. James Jupp of the Australian National University says, and I quote, "There is no other definitive book on Australian multiculturalism. Andrew Theophanous has filled this gap with his polemical but thoroughly scholarly work, which I commend." Understanding Multiculturalism and an Australian Identity confirms the fine tradition of Elakir Books in being associated with scholarly works containing a multicultural flavour. This is our 15th such publication. The national distribution of this book is being undertaken by Tower Books of Sydney. The launch of this book takes the following form. Both the Prime Minister and Dr. Theophanous will speak. It is my great pleasure to now invite the Prime Minister to officially launch Understanding Multiculturalism and Australian Identity. Friends, the Prime Minister.
Well, thank you very much indeed, William. Could I also acknowledge High Commissioner of Great Britain, other distinguished members of the Diplomatic Corps, Mr. Rebikoff and Lois O'Donoghue, and of course my parliamentary colleagues, other distinguished guests, Andrew, and ladies and gentlemen. Well, about this time every year, Andrew has a new book. And it's become, at least once in my itinerary, agenda for the course of the year, I always say at the beginning of the year, we better put a day in for Andrew, he'll have another book. And I'm very happy to be here this morning to launch this one. And it reminds me, I think, of 2 points. One is that there are people in the Labor Party, Labor Party, full of people who have all sorts of views about all sorts of things, that are in the business of politics out of conviction, not convenience. And you can see this just in this work alone that Andrew has done, how thoughtful he has been, and how he thinks about Australia, thinks about the way in which it's changing, and tries to write down and record and perhaps lead in the way in which it's the way in which Australian thought has changed and is changing. So it's a very interesting polemic he has written, and the energy, the prodigious energy which he displays with these publications is, of course, quite profound. He's talking about, of course, the perhaps singular most defining feature of Australian society today, and that is the impact of the post-war migration program on the culture and identity of the country. And it is, we believe, a great success story. We don't presume it's a model for the rest of the world, but I think we are an example of a culturally pluralist society that works pretty well. And in this text, he's, I think, trying to tell the reader why he thinks it works well, and to say that it's informed, our whole process is informed by democratic common sense. His main theme, I think, is that multiculturalism is successful because of the strength of the nation's oldest values, that is egalitarianism principally, the belief that everyone deserves a fair chance or a fair go, and our deep-rooted sense of democracy and our basic tolerance, which comes from it, is the thing which has given people the psychological space to let multiculturalism work in a way that we've been able to draw strength from it. He says that rather than diluting Australia's culture, it's replenished it around the theme that the place is essentially deeply democratic and tolerant and egalitarian, and that the influences of multiculturalism have in fact highlighted, sharpened and replenished those instincts, and that people have brought colour and ambition to Australia, and that has generally supported the tendency we've all had to these democratic ideals and democratic tradition. And I think people coming from, particularly in the early phases from Europe, who have in the first instance changed the nature of the culture of Australia, have found when they have come here, particularly rent by 2 world wars, that the opportunities for freedom in Australia, where these values abound, and also in the sun, because it always feels easier, I think, to feel happy and free in a temperate climate than one does rugged up under a grey sky. That the whole notion of, you know, you share in the bounty of the country, whether you are wealthy or not, when you share in the pleasure of its environment. And I think all of that has produced, you know, a great view that amongst migrants and in the community, that the multiculturalism that has arisen from it has truly replenished that which we've had here. Of course, no policy of the government or no document could make multiculturalism work. That has to come from the community itself. But a strong government commitment to multiculturalism is necessary, and it is that commitment which I think Andrew rejoices in the Labor Party, and I think that we enjoy as a party with people in the community. Could I also say that in saying that, I don't believe that multiculturalism must ever be allowed to become an ideological position, a sort of repository of political correctness, or something beyond criticism. But certain things are beyond the pale, like a racial basis in discrimination of our immigration system, or discrimination against migrants in the workplace, etc. But I think the theme that the government has been perhaps touching in the last couple of years is our general embrace of multiculturalism, but making clear that everybody's first loyalty has to be to Australia. That is, within the bounds of Australian democracy and egalitarianism, the things which Andrew argues is actually feeding and replenishing our culture, the inspiration of it has to be always that which the democracy is about, and that is the first loyalty to the society we've created here and our first loyalty to Australia. And of course that is most obviously expressed in the allegiance which the government strongly encourages, and that's of course taking Australian citizenship. which we're now seeing, we're seeing, I think, as a growing tendency amongst people who've had permanent resident status. Andrew's book sets out a narrative on the government's recent advances. The National Agenda for Multiculturalism, first released in 1989. The National Multicultural Advisory Council has reviewed the National Agenda for us, and the government will soon formally respond to their report. The racial hatred legislation, commitment to access and equity principles, the platform on which multiculturalism is built itself, which is social justice. He refers to this and he says that social justice, the very essence of social justice, are the things that hold the egalitarian notions together, hence the underpinnings of multiculturalism. And he goes through some of the elements of it: Medicare, education and training, superannuation for everybody, and in the broader, of course, the native title legislation, which brings into the social justice equation more obviously, of course, the first Australians. Now, these are all things which I think that we see as a matrix, as threads of a fabric. That is, it's not just about the migration program, it's not just about a separate cultural identification with the countries of origin of people, but it's about a bigger thing, that they can identify these historic interests with the newfound, in the case of those who arrived as migrants, freedom and democracy here, which is itself fed by a long egalitarian tradition, which is itself supported by social justice and social justice policies. And so while these things might seem to be in the realm of social policy, they are in fact part of community policy. These are points we often make with our opponents wearily about things such as Medicare and education and training, because education is the great boundary jumper. It's the place where people skip through the stratums. And when only 3 children in 10 completed secondary school 10 years ago, you can bet that most of the 7 of the 10, of course, represented preponderantly those of lower incomes and disadvantaged groups. And now, of course, this year, that's 8 in 10 completing secondary school, and we've had now 60% addition to tertiary places and an enormous revolution in vocational education, so that where once only 40% of people were trained after secondary school, 60% cascading into essentially a labour market within which they were not equipped with skills, we'll have now the great bulk of the community, 90% odd, coming into a training situation, post-secondary training. And that is not a statement about education, it's a statement about your society, it's a statement about mobility, it's a statement about the brightest people being chosen on their abilities from within the education system rather than their parents' income or their parents' social position. And all of this is, of course, made it likely that the children of migrants take a greater role in the society. So giving people universal protection against sickness, which is not a market matter. Your well-being should not be a matter for the marketplace. Education, training, the right to a decent income in retirement so that the Commonwealth's tax concessions are equitably drawn down. All of these things, we think in the Labor Party, buttress the whole notion of society and buttress the notion of multiculturalism. Now, you know, it's rare for me these days in a public address to ever let the coalition off, and I'm not going to do it today either. And I just wanted to say a couple of things about them, because there's a lot to say about them. Even though they don't say much, there's still a lot to say about them. And we found something that goes to this subject, which is a report which Senator Short, the Shadow Minister for Immigration and Ethnic Affairs, had commissioned by Mr. Zachary Wilkes of the University of Michigan. A document entitled Building Australia's Future, an evaluation of settlement services prepared for the office of Senator Jim Short, Shadow Minister for Immigration and Ethnic Affairs. In his covering letter to select migrant and ethnic groups, Senator Short states that this paper is Mr. Wilkes' personal view and does not represent a coalition position. However, as the document makes clear, it's a research document prepared for, by and with the active cooperation of Senator Short and his office, and it carries hence his imprimatur, and it's just been distributed officially by him at public expense. And it says the Coalition is currently reviewing several important matters in the area of multicultural affairs and settlement services, and I'd appreciate hearing from you on the topics identified. Should the Coalition win the next election, I'm sure this officially sanctioned circulated paper would no doubt be used by a Howard government as some sort of mandate for adopting the radical changes it recommends. But I'll give you a little taste of just a couple of pieces of it. It says, all business and skilled entrants, including concessional family entrants who are in a skill-assessed class, should be required to have English as a precondition of entry. Without an English ability, their skills or business acumen are virtually worthless in and to Australia. Well, of course, bad luck for Peter Abels and Frank Lowy and Franco Belgiorno Nettis. They wouldn't have made the grade on that basis. Then it goes on, if they do not attend the courses or attain English elsewhere, then they should be denied access to welfare benefits. In the future, their sponsors should bear their living costs. In other words, if they don't attend courses and attain proficiency in English, they shouldn't get welfare benefits, and their sponsors should be reminded they'll have to carry the costs. It's so friendly. And it goes on to say this, migrants without English ability, including humanitarian and refugee entrants in particular, should be required to undertake English language courses as a priority for settlement. They should continue to receive financial assistance while they're undertaking these courses. However, if they fail to attend class or drop out prematurely, then they should not be eligible for future unemployment assistance unless they've attained English either through the courses or elsewhere. It's a hard world Mr. Howard has in mind for the rest of us. And then he goes on to say, I mean, I wish Margaret Thatcher had come to Canberra recently. She could have endorsed Johnny as well as Jeff. And it says that she would have endorsed this for sure. If all else fails, the government may have to look at more prescriptive methods to ensure migrants attain sufficient English skills so they can fully participate in society and are not at risk or impost to either themselves or the community. Such a proposal could involve proficiency certificates that would be awarded by accredited English programs and presented when applying for a job. But here's a little rub. Employers who fail to check for the certificates could be made subject to fines. You see all those nasty employers out there employing people who don't speak fluent English. Anyway, it goes on. There's pages and pages of it. I won't bore you with it. It's just typical of the Coalition's snaky approach to multiculturalism. You know, I mean, one of the things I said to Alexander Downer was multiculturalism is more than heading for the nearest Chinese restaurant. It's more than chasing a meatball round a plate with a pair of chopsticks, which was what he did on his first foray to a Chinese restaurant in my electorate. Now, in the Labor Party, of course, proficiency with chopsticks comes at the age of 16. In the Liberal Party, it comes at about 42 or 43 years of age. But by then, the capacity for dexterity is long past, so they never quite make it. There's certainly no accreditation in their use. But I don't know whether these things have ever occurred to our friends in the Coalition. At any rate, they don't have a view that we have, that the thing that multiculturalism has done has been to enlarge Australia, to make it bigger and to make it better, to make it more interesting, to make it more resilient, and to do as Andrew suggests, replenish those basic instincts of egalitarianism and democracy. And in that sense, as people live their lives here, as their children grow up here, the culture of Australia has changed to a newer identity, but one as uniquely Australian as that which some of the rest of us might have identified 30 or 40 or 50 years ago. And indeed, given our place in the world, our proximity to old societies, large old societies like Indonesia, very old societies like Papua New Guinea, and our proximity also to the fastest growing markets in the world. The change to Australia is one that in our cultural diversity is not just a social strength, but a strength in approaching these markets and being part of the community and region in a way we might not have conceived before. And I've made the point, and Andrew makes it well here, that you can't ever really be thinking about a society at peace with itself, comfortable with the changing nature of its culture and its identity, without, of course, understanding that the people who must feel comfortable in this are our Indigenes. Now, it's going to take a long time before the Australian Indigenes feel comfortable with Australia the way it is now, but I think we've made as strong a renewal of our efforts to do that as perhaps any government has, certainly in recent years, and we're going to keep that commitment up. But you can't say that the place is open and fair and democratic if one important and key section is excluded from opportunity or where the barriers to participation are too great. So that's why that happy mix of social policy runs with the whole current of our society, and it's why too, with a republic, that in renouncing a European monarch as our head of state, we would have made that affirmation of the way in which we have changed, and to say to all the people who have joined us that they are more likely to be and more welcome in being an integral part of society which they volunteered to belong to. So I think we in the party owe Andrew a debt for getting this down, because debates come and go, and the plasma of the debates exist at the time, but then they disappear. And you try and remember what debates were like 10 years ago or 20 years ago, and you can remember the highlights, but you don't remember the flux. And I think what this text does is put that down. It puts all of the issues down, it gives us the threads of the debate, and records this quite distinctive, defining change in our history. And for that, we thank Andrew, and it's therefore with great pleasure that I officially launch his text.
Prime Minister, stimulatory, progressive, thought-provoking. Thank you very much indeed. Ladies and gentlemen, the author of Understanding Multiculturalism and Australian Identity, Dr. Andrew Theophanous.
Well, thank you very much, Prime Minister, and thank you for your comments. Ministers, members of Parliament, ambassadors, distinguished guests from academia and the ethnic communities, ladies and gentlemen. And I want to particularly single out three people who I think in a way symbolise what this book is all about. Al Grasby, who in a sense began it all and as a minister in the Whitlam government. Victor Rebekhoff, who's the chairperson of the important organisation, the Ethnic Communities Councils of Australia, the Federation, and Lois O'Donoghue, of course, who's the chairperson of ATSIC. But all of you here have in some way or another been involved or interested in the promotion of multiculturalism, so I'm very honoured that you're here today. Now, I want to convey to you just a few things about this book and why I wrote it and what I'm trying to say. In the last 50 years, Australia has developed into a very different society from that which existed in the pre-war years. A society with a great diversity of cultures, languages and traditions. The introduction of multiculturalism in the early 1970s by the Whitlam government gave official recognition and respect to the cultural heritage of the migrant communities. Since the early 1970s, multiculturalism has developed, as the Prime Minister said, into a highly successful social policy and philosophy for this country. And yet, despite its success, multiculturalism has generated tremendous political and public debate. While multiculturalism has been supported by a large proportion of the population, there have also been many critics, some of whom have argued that it was a contradiction in terms to suggest that people from diverse cultural and ethnic backgrounds could live peaceably together while maintaining their cultural traditions. Perhaps the most common criticism level against multiculturalism is the claim that it undermines social cohesion. Most prominent amongst the critics of multiculturalism have been Geoffrey Blainey and, of course, in 1988 period, the then and now opposition leader John Howard. As you'll remember, in 1988, Mr Howard attempted to set up a conflict between multiculturalism and what he claimed to be the true Australian identity. Now, as my book documents, Mr Howard's claims created tensions within the Australian community and even split his own party. My book includes a comprehensive rebuttal of the criticisms of multiculturalism and defends it against those who would seek to undermine and abolish it. I argue that rather than being contradictory to Australian national identity, multiculturalism, properly understood, has much in common with the fundamental elements of the traditional Australian identity, namely fairness and equality. I further argue that a merging of the multicultural ideal with Australians' traditional respect of the fair go holds the key to the Australian identity of the future. And this becomes obvious when we consider the controversial question of what it means to be an Australian today. Of course, the answer goes beyond the idea that an Australian is someone who lives in this land and holds formal citizenship. It goes to a set of values and beliefs that we share and that capture the essence of what it means to be an Australian. In my book, I explore the nature of Australian identity prior to the development of multiculturalism. I concluded there were both positive and negative aspects associated with being an Australian. And the positive aspects relate to the very strong egalitarian or social justice tradition in this country. This tradition has been part of the Australian identity for more than 150 years. Indeed, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Australian society was a trailblazer in the implementation of the ideas of fairness and equality of opportunity. We were among the first countries to extend the right to vote to women, to adopt a minimum basic wage, to introduce reasonable unemployment benefits, and to provide services in health, education and welfare to all citizens. But there was a negative side to that early Australian identity, the rejection of other cultures and traditions. And this emphasis on a monocultural concept of Australian society was reflected in the White Australia policy. It was only with the development of the policy and philosophy of multiculturalism that the meaning of Australian identity has been made more inclusive and more relevant to modern society. The meaning of multiculturalism is examined in great detail in my book. I argue that there are two key elements of multiculturalism as a philosophy and a policy. These two elements constituted two phases in the historical evolution of multiculturalism. The first phase saw multiculturalism in terms of the positive affirmation of cultural diversity. It emphasised the importance of cultural maintenance, of encouraging people to retain their cultural heritage and celebrate their cultural tradition. The second phase saw the introduction of the social justice dimension of multiculturalism. There was a recognition that multiculturalism was not just about ensuring individual freedom, but also about genuine social justice for all people, irrespective of their racial, cultural, ethnic or religious backgrounds. The fundamental principle was that if people in Australia from diverse cultural backgrounds were entitled to genuine social equality, especially in access to health, employment and education services. It has been Australia's willingness to move beyond the tokenism of belly dancing and baklava, or as the Prime Minister mentioned, Chinese restaurants, and provide social and economic equality for migrants that has ensured the success of multiculturalism. And these two elements of multiculturalism have been recognised, as the Prime Minister said, in the National Agenda for Multicultural Australia in 1989 and in the Keating government's emphasis on the access and equity strategy. Now, social justice, therefore, is a common thread that links the traditional identity with multiculturalism. In order to further define ourselves as a nation, I believe that we must place this concept of social justice at the heart of our national identity. The key to achieving this synthesis is a deeper appreciation and understanding of the idea of citizenship in Australia. For the idea of citizenship has been changing, both from the development of social justice and from the development of multiculturalism. We no longer rely simply on the traditional 19th century concept of the nation-state. We must add to that idea that citizenship involves certain commitments beyond that to democratic rights, but also to social and economic rights, to social justice in general. In the old days, there existed a narrow idea of citizenship, but now we must extend citizenship to incorporate both the ideas of social justice and the idea of multiculturalism. But we must go further than that, because the idea of social rights has not been incorporated into the broader, because the idea of social right has been incorporated into a broader idea of citizenship, many groups in Australian society, including women, ethnic groups, Indigenous people, and the disabled community, that's in earlier time, because it had not been incorporated, they didn't feel part of the system. But now, in concrete terms, we can develop this more active idea of Australian citizenship. And such a citizenship can embed social rights, responsibilities as citizens, and respect for cultural diversity. And in my book, I argue that this new national identity must be linked to the Indigenous rights agenda, as the Prime Minister mentioned, and to the evolution of an Australian republic. In conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, multiculturalism has attempted to strike a balance between the rights of all people to cultural, religious and ethnic identification, while at the same time encouraging a sense of social solidarity and a commitment to the Australian nation. And the most important challenge for multiculturalism has been to establish this basis of unity in cultural diversity. Multiculturalism is not a peripheral issue in Australian society. It should not be vulnerable, as it presently is, to the turning of the political tides. The 1990s is a decade of great challenges and great changes for Australia. As we approach the centennial federation, we have the opportunity to develop a society where citizenship is defined not merely in geographical terms, but also in terms of a shared recognition and respect for cultural diversity and a shared commitment to the principles of social justice. I hope that my book encourages the development of the vision of a future for this country based on the unique opportunity afforded by the synthesis, as the Prime Minister said, of our social justice egalitarian traditions and the multicultural ideal. I would like to thank a number of people who helped the preparation of this book. Many of them are mentioned in the preface, and I will not single them out today. Many of you here today have helped me in the preparation of the book through your discussions and ideas. I would like, however, to specifically mention some people who have been invaluable. Abby Howe, Virginia Wellard, Carolyn Holbrook, Catherine Erickson, Helen Jenkins, Kathy King, Mary Kalantzis and Bill Albon. I would also like to thank my parliamentary colleagues for their help. Again, they are too numerous to mention, but I single out Nick Bolkus, Carmen Lawrence, Clyde Holding, Simon Crean, Brian Howe and Leo McClay. I would like to thank you, Prime Minister, not only for launching this book, but for your support as in my work as Parliamentary Secretary in trying to ensure concrete achievements in the access and equity strategy across government portfolios. Most of all, I would like to thank you for your vision of a united, culturally diverse Australia. And I would also like to thank and to acknowledge my daughter Marika, who's here with us today, and to whom this book is dedicated. Marika is in many ways a symbol of the new generation of multicultural Australians. She has a Dutch-Australian mother and a Greek-Australian father, and yet she's totally committed to this land and its values. Thank you all very much.
Friends, that concludes the formal part of the launch of Understanding Multiculturalism and an Australian Identity. I want to thank Dr. Theophanous as our author for his contribution just now. I want to thank him for the book and the effort that's gone with that. I want to, on behalf of Alakia, urge you to get out there and buy it and get other people to buy it. And I would like to say that Dr. Theophanous is available to talk to men and women of the media, that there, for other guests, there's tea and coffee served, and the complimentary book, or copy of the book that you all received, Dr. Theophanous would sign and autograph copies of that book should people wish. Thank you very much for coming again today. Brother, I can live with that. I can live with that.
There seems to be a strong possibility the employer may be responsible in the future.
I suppose it really comes down to reasonable care, doesn't it? And then how far does that extend?
Well, I think employers need to think about their Christmas parties. They need to ensure that they're providing sensible drinking alternatives. They need to make sure that if people are drinking, they're not driving, that they're given taxis home or they got home in some manner, and certainly not given the opportunity to operate dangerous equipment where they can endanger their own lives or other people.
Yeah, tell me, Tony, if work care covers an employee to and from work, does it also apply that the boss is responsible should an employee have too much to drink and is involved in an accident on the way home?
Well, the areas of negligence are being examined all the time, Mal, but it seems to me that a responsible employer would make sure that his employees are protected and are at minimum risk. And it's not absolutely certain an employer is responsible for their individuals getting to and from work, except where they have provided an unacceptable risk, such as providing alcohol.
I wonder whether Christmas parties have actually run their course.
No,
it's too much trouble.
Well, the spirit of Christmas is important. It's a good time for organisations to review the year, to look back and thank their employees, but it's also a good opportunity for